The North American continent was once home to over 500 separate tribes with close to 300 different languages spoken from Canada to Central America. It is not known exactly when the first humans settled in North America, but it is known that they came across the narrow gap between what is now Russia and Alaska as the glaciers began to recede better than 10,000 years ago. There is a dispute over how many Indians populated North America, but it has been estimated that at least 12 million lived in what is now the United States, and close to 100 million including Canada, Mexico, and Central America. While it is celebrated that Columbus was the first European to discover the new country, the first explorers were the Vikings. The Vikings sailed from the British Isles to Greenland, where they established a colony which they would eventually abandon. They would also explore Labrador, the Baffin Islands, and Newfoundland. This occurred around 1000 AD, but it was a brief period of exploration. It was not until Columbus made his 4 journeys in the late 1400s and early 1500s that Europeans would return. Before permanent settlements were established on the east coast of the United States, fishermen from England and France fished off the coast of New England. Occasionally they would wade ashore in search of provisions, particularly fresh water. There would be encounters with Indians, and it was not unusual that Indians would be captured and brought back as slaves. These encounters began the introduction of European diseases that would decimate the native population. It is estimated that diseases destroyed close to 90% of the Indian population in New England before the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Christopher Columbus convinced Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain to provide him with men and ships by promising more gold than they could imagine. When Columbus landed in the New World, he was met by a docile people who managed to save many Spaniards when one of the 3 ships, the Santa Maria, wrecked. He did not find his riches, but he did return to Spain to report sighting rivers of gold. He also left 39 men behind. These men would create mayhem, mistreating the natives, including rape, until they were finally disposed of. Upon Columbus' return, having learned the fate of those he left behind, began a system of rape and pillage. The Spaniards would test the sharpness of their blades by cutting the natives in half or beheading them in contests. When Columbus returned for a 3rd time, he was under pressure to deliver on his promise of treasure. On what is now Haiti, the natives were enslaved and had to supply a certain amount of gold. Those who did not meet the quota had their hands cut off. This was all documented by Bartolomé de las Casas, who had been a slave owner on what is now Cuba. But after witnessing the savagery, became an advocate for indigenous people, eventually rising to become Bishop of Chiapas. Within 2 years, 250,000 natives of Haiti had died at the hands of their captors. More Spanish explorers would follow Columbus in search of mineral wealth, including Ponce de Leon, who landed in what is now Puerto Rico. There he quickly killed or enslaved the native population before heading to Florida in search of a magical spring that brought perpetual youth. Ponce de Leon would die at the hands of the Indians during his search, but was soon followed by the Spanish explorers. It wouldn't take long for the Indians to figure out what the Europeans were looking for, and devised a way to get them to move on. In search of gold, the Indians would tell the explorers that the next village had the gold they were looking for. Hernando de Soto led an expedition that would explore deep into America, reaching as far as the Appalachian Mountains, before heading west and finding the Mississippi River. After 5 years of fruitless search, De Soto would die, and the surviving members of his party would sail down the Mississippi, following the Gulf Coast until reaching Spanish settlements in Mexico. Following the failure of De Soto's expedition, Spain would abandon further exploration. Mexico was being exploited, and ships laden with treasure were sailing every day for Spain. But other European countries began to prey on these ships, so Spain established a permanent settlement at St. Augustine, Florida. As expected, the native population did not receive the intruders well, and outposts were under constant attack. Unlike in Mexico, the Spanish discovered the local Indians were less inclined to submit to the will of the Europeans. But soon Franciscan and Jesuit friars arrived, and a new tactic, the mission station, was established in an attempt to control the Indians. Small chapels were constructed in the wilderness where friars would interact with the Indians. Learning their language, the friars would teach the Indians to farm and slowly introduce them to Christianity. The mission stations would extend throughout Florida and across the southern Gulf Coast into Texas and well into the southwestern part of what is now the United States. To the north, following years of internal strife, the French began to explore the eastern half of Canada. Jacques Cartier led an expedition of the St. Lawrence River where he would encounter Indians that seemed fascinated by white men. There was no gold or silver to be found, but Cartier returned to France where he reported a beautiful land that deserved further exploration. Subsequent trips were made and fishing villages were established where grounds were so fertile that fishing could be done by scooping fish out of the water with baskets. In the early 1600s, the British began to explore and settle on the eastern shore of the United States. Jamestown, Virginia, and Plymouth, Massachusetts were the most well-known of these establishments. Soon other settlements were being established as more ships arrived and further exploration commenced. Initial contact with the Indians was friendly, and cultural practices of the Indians helped early settlers, in particular the Pilgrims in Massachusetts. Folklore explains that the first Thanksgiving was attributed to the Wampanoag tribe providing a feast for the Pilgrims the first winter that saved them. But one of the more universally believed facts was that the Wampanoag showed the Pilgrims that rotating plantings of crops would ensure a fertile soil and a more productive harvest. Years later, following the death of Chief Massasoit, relations began to deteriorate. His son, Wamsuta, died in mysterious circumstances following his first meeting with the settlers, which was later attributed to disease. The relationship was further complicated when 3 Wampanoag men were hung for a murder of a white man that proved to be false. The Wampanoag population, which was already in decline due to disease, attacked the British settlements in the King Richard's War. More than half the settlements were burned to the ground, but the British regrouped and eventually suppressed the uprising. Chief Metacom, son of Chief Massasoit, who had led the uprising, was killed and his head was placed on a post, displayed in the village of Plymouth for more than 20 years. This was not the first clash between white settlers and Indians. As the settlers continued to explore south of Plymouth, they encountered the Pequot in the Mystic and Thames River region of present-day Connecticut. Disputes started over property incursions and then extended to livestock destroying Indian crops. Alcohol was introduced to the Pequot as well, and disease was having an impact on the tribe. Internal strife within the Pequot created problems as 2 chiefs separated the tribe over the settlers. Following the murder of a disreputable trader by the Pequot, action was demanded. Pequot villages were attacked and burned to the ground, with few Pequots surviving. The Mohegan, who had split with the Pequot, sided with the settlers and joined the attack. The war, which took place from 1636 and 7, annihilated a tribe of 20,000. Any survivors were given as slaves or sent as slaves to the West Indies. The name Pequot was outlawed following the war. To the south, the British established a settlement at Jamestown, the first permanent settlement in the United States. Here they encountered the Powhatan tribe, who were hospitable and helpful. But soon tensions rose due to the ongoing need for food, a disrespectful attitude toward the Indians that was fueled by drunkenness. After aid was cut off by Chief Powhatan, his daughter, Mata-o-Ka, also known as Pocahontas, was kidnapped. While in captivity, it is said she fell in love with John Rolfe, and later, in an attempt to promote peace, was given permission to marry. Rolfe was credited with turning tobacco into a cash crop. Following Chief Powhatan's death, his brother, angered by more settlers arriving, led an attack against Jamestown. An error in strategy prevented total destruction of Jamestown, and for the next 10 years there were skirmishes as more settlers arrived and took more land, forcing the Powhatan further inland. Chief Opechancanough tried to rally an assault to stop the intrusion but was later captured and died in captivity. The new chief, Nakatawance, would sign the first treaty between Indian and white man with a familiar theme: Indian conceding territory. The British believed in the Discovery Doctrine, which gave immediate and automatic property rights in a native land, as well as political and commercial rights over its inhabitants. This was done without the knowledge or consent of the indigenous people, and this was an accepted international law. It was created and justified by religious and ethnocentric ideas of European and Caucasian superiority. As Europeans steadily arrived, mostly British, French, and Spanish, Indians became pawns. The 7 Years' War, which was also known as the French and Indian War, had tribes joining both sides. The French were able to enlist more tribes due to the British displacing more Indians than the French. But the Indians paid a heavy price for their alliances. Often their villages were attacked and burned to the ground when it was learned they sided with either the British or the French. The Cherokee in particular suffered with more than 15 villages destroyed and over 15,000 acres of crops burned in South Carolina in a single action. The war, which ended in 1763, did produce a short-lived victory for the Indians with the Proclamation of 1763. It was forbidden to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. But this came after British General Jeffrey Amherst offered to supply the Shawnee and Delaware tribes with blankets as winter was approaching. Seen as a gesture of goodwill, the blankets were infected with smallpox, which quickly spread. British troop levels were not adequate to continue the war, and the two tribes, devastated by the disease, agreed to the proclamation from a weakened position. Following the end of the American Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris was very generous to the victors. It ceded all land east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of Canada to the new American nation. But Indians were not included in any negotiations, even though the 1763 law prevented Western expansion. After the adoption of the Constitution, newly elected President George Washington signed the first Indian Intercourse Act of 1790. The act did not allow transfer of any land by Indians without the involvement of the federal government. Washington was wary of the Indians. During the Revolution, he ordered the destruction of the Iroquois following the massacre of settlers. Whole Iroquois settlements were burned to the ground, its inhabitants killed, and crops, farms, and orchards were destroyed. Washington was also aware that Indians still outnumbered the white population, and that seizing more land would lead to further hostilities. Annuities would be paid to tribes when land transfers took place. This also prevented tribes from joining together against the United States, as negotiations were kept secret from rival tribes. This was a tactic that would be played over repeatedly in the years ahead. The early attitude towards the Indian culture was not to destroy, but to transform, to adapt to the white man's world. Indians were looked upon as savages, and there was an impulse to save the Indian by encouraging their conversion to Christianity. In the southern areas still under French control, missionaries were set up with mixed results. Indians in most instances would resist assimilation, and the government was forced to act, usually by expulsion or death. As the United States grew and moved from coastal communities inland, settlers clashed with Indians. Here the settlers would ask the government to act, but Washington was aware of the limitations of the federal government. Further legislation in the form of the Intercourse Acts of 1793 and 1796 encouraged trade with Indians, but also emphasized legal transfer of land in an attempt to prevent further clashes. A series of treaties negotiated that further included annuities paid to Indians. It also included payments to settlers who suffered from damage due to the clashes. The money would come from annuities promised to the Indians from land transfers. When Thomas Jefferson became the third United States president, he was the first to suggest a removal policy. Jefferson felt that on an intellectual level, Indians were on the same level as whites. But he was also concerned by their primitive behavior and felt that a transformation could be achieved by teaching simple skills. This would lead to a greater appreciation of white man's ways. He was not anti-religious, feeling that faith was part of civilized society, but he was against a religion-first mentality in regards to Indian assimilation. Since the assimilation process was not going as planned, it was suggested that moving all Indians west of the Mississippi would allow time to civilize them. But early efforts failed, and after Jefferson left office, his successors, James Monroe and John Quincy Adams did not act in regards to relocation. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court heard the case of Johnson versus McIntosh, which became a landmark decision. The case involved land ownership and a purchase of land from Indians. The United States, since declaring its independence, had inherited the British right of preemption over Indian land, the Discovery Doctrine. The court upheld the doctrine, which limited sovereignty, religion, and conquest, and affirmed the government possessed sovereign power over Indian nations and could impose laws in tribal territory. It found that only the federal government could purchase land from Indians, but also stipulated that Indians only had a right of occupancy. They did not own the land, they only lived on it. Cherokee Nations versus Georgia was handed down in 1831, and while it affirmed that the Cherokee had rights and the state of Georgia had no jurisdiction over Indians, the ruling was largely ignored. Andrew Jackson, who was elected president in 1828, favored Indian removal. Andrew Jackson was a war hero. As a young man, his family had suffered greatly during the Revolutionary War, losing 2 brothers. His father had died before he was born, and his mother would also die during the Revolutionary War, caring for wounded soldiers when Jackson was only 14. He would suffer a beating when he refused to shine a British soldier's boots while in captivity. When the War of 1812 started, Jackson was wary of Indians siding with the British. When the Creek tribe assaulted Fort Mims in Alabama, Jackson was called to retaliate. He led an attack on a Creek village that was savage, causing some in the attacking force to be repulsed. Jackson did not stop there, attacking more villages over the course of a year, winning the cessation of over 23 million acres of land. One particular battle at Horseshoe Bend was considered the last major battle between Indians and the white man east of the Mississippi. But it was the Battle of New Orleans that made Jackson a war hero. The battle took place in 1812 after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. The British suffered a devastating loss of men against minimal United States losses. So complete was the victory that it made Jackson a national figure. There were 3 subsequent Seminole Wars, the first from 1816 to 1818, which was started by Jackson. The Seminole War was a guerrilla war, and the United States suffered heavy losses over the 3 separate wars. Escaped slaves had joined the Seminole Indians in Florida, and Jackson entered Florida to stop more runaway slaves from escaping and joining the Seminoles. Jackson had a superior force in both numbers and arms. He destroyed many Seminole villages and captured the town of Pensacola, but could not defeat the Indian force and eventually withdrew. Spain soon ceded Florida to the United States in 1819. In 1828, Jackson was elected the 7th President of the United States. One of his first goals was the removal of all Indians from the vicinity of the white population. The removal would take a couple of years to accomplish and involve the 5 civilized tribes. These tribes were the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and the Seminoles. They were called civilized because they adopted constitutional governments, had many converts to Christianity, and had formed school systems. They had, in essence, assimilated. The Cherokee also sided with Jackson in his war with the Creek, and was a major reason why he was successful in battle. The state of Georgia was constantly complaining about the Indian problem. They held too much land and were a threat to white people. When gold was discovered in 1829, a new series of problems arose when one of the sites bordered Cherokee Nation. When white intruders were evicted by Indian agents, the state of Georgia objected. After continual intrusion, Indian agents led by Major Ridge burned settlers' homes and evicted the squatters. Georgian authorities responded by sending a posse after the agents. But the amount of gold discovered on the land was not of consequence. Real estate was the ultimate prize, especially for the expanding cotton industry. President Jackson had had enough and introduced the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Cherokee Nation turned to the Supreme Court to fight the removal, and the court found in favor of the Cherokee. But Jackson ignored the ruling and declared that Chief Justice John Marshall may uphold the law, but let him try to enforce it. Soon fractures would divide the Cherokee into 2 groups, those for and those against removal. Major Ridge and his son John Ridge were for selling the land and leaving. Chief John Ross and the majority of Cherokee were against moving. In 1835, Major Ridge and John Ridge signed the Treaty of Echota, giving up Cherokee land. John Ross and the majority of Cherokee Nation refused to leave. 6 years after the Supreme Court ruling, the 16,000 remaining Cherokee were herded into camps in preparation for the forced move west of the Mississippi. While waiting in the camps, they suffered from malnutrition, dysentery, physical and sexual abuse. When the first group began to march in the summer of 1838, so many died from heat exhaustion that the government decided to wait until fall. Better than 25% would die on the trek to Oklahoma. It would be called the Trail of Tears. Of the 16,000 forced to relocate, 3,000 had been farmers, 400 were mechanics, and close to 6,000 were weavers and spinners. They operated mills and ferries. None were listed as hunters or warriors. They had assimilated into the white man's world. When soldiers arrived to forcibly remove the Cherokee from their homes, their white neighbors wasted no time in plundering their homes. The 5 civilized tribes resettled in Oklahoma, and the Mississippi River was intended to be a barrier between the Indians and white people. But soon whites were appearing on the eastern banks. It was clear that soon the barrier would be breached. Following the expulsion of the tribes east of the Mississippi, there was an effort at legislation to protect the tribes in the unorganized territory west. William Medill was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, appointed by President James Polk in 1845. In 1847, the Indian Intercourse Act was passed, and it addressed issues perpetrated by white people in dealing with Indians. Alcohol had been an issue from the earliest interactions between whites and Indians. It was determined that bartering with Indians using alcohol would now be punishable with a 2-year jail sentence. The act also included language pertaining to individual Indian debt, which was deemed not binding. It was declared a whole tribe matter. This angered the trading companies, many who perpetrated unfair trade practices, knowing the Indians did not have any legal standing in financial disputes. Medill favored the reservation system as a way to both save the Indian and allow for Western expansion, manifest destiny. Medill reasoned that by moving the tribes away from travel routes, it protected wagon trains from Indian assault, but also protected Indians from unscrupulous white merchants and traders. Medill would resign in 1849 under pressure from the powerful trade lobbyists, and his superior, Secretary of Interior Thomas Ewing, would scrap the progressive movement. All Indian field agents were replaced and claims against individual Indians were reinstated. Ewing also invoked portions of the Act of 1830, which allowed further Indian removal westward, including the Chippewa from Minnesota. But Ewing would come under investigation for corruption and resign. The Bureau of Indian Affairs would be led by Luke Lea. Lea was also a proponent of the reservation system, as he saw it as a way for the Indian to have a permanent home. He also advocated that in order to lessen the strain of being confined to a reservation, the government should supply the Indian with the means to survive, including educational and religious activities. The Indian Appropriation Act of 1851 was an attempt to negotiate a treaty with the tribes of the plains and mountains to give up land and move to reservations. There was a white migration westward to Oregon, California, and Utah, and this was an attempt to prevent further attacks on the migration. But this early attempt at creating reservations would fail due to the weakness of the Indian Affairs Bureau, a lack of concern by the federal government as a whole, and states refusing to follow federal law. In Texas, which recently became a state, it was hoped the federal government would remove Indians as it had with the eastern U.S., but the government asked for land concessions to establish reservations. This did not sit well with independent-minded Texans, who were also dealing with incursions by Mexican nationals. Indian tribes such as the Comanche began to raid settlements as Texans intruded on traditional Indian hunting grounds. Texas Rangers were brought in to bring some control, which only made the situation worse. A weak federal response complicated matters, and a renewed call for reservation land was ignored by Texas as settlers continued to occupy Indian land. By 1854, Texans were finally agreeable to land for reservations, which meant conceding control to the federal government. But it was a failure as the land granted was too small, and there was still resentment by local citizens. Armed incursions into reservations led to the slaughter of many tribes. Within 5 years, Texas got what it wanted when the federal government stepped in and removed all Indians from Texas. In 1851, the major tribes of the Plains agreed to the Fort Laramie Treaty, where the tribes agreed to territorial restrictions in exchange for an assurance of survival. But what the chiefs who signed the treaty didn't understand was that they were victims. Going forward, the government would begin a series of negotiations with individual tribes. By separating the tribes and negotiating on an individual tribal basis, they slowly reduced the size of each tribe's land. There were still nomadic tribes who refused to submit to the terms of the Laramie Treaty. Resistance continued to grow, and between 1860 and 1890, there was a series of massacres perpetrated by soldiers and private citizens as the western expansion moved into the plains. As the westward expansion continued, the lush forests of the Mississippi gave way to the grasslands of the plains. Unlike the tribes of the East and Texas, the Plains tribes were nomadic. When Spanish explorers made their inward exploration, they introduced horses to the Indians. Over time, the Indians became master horsemen, and this helped them hunt buffalo, the main food staple. The Indians were dependent on buffalo for survival, as it provided not only meat, but also hides for clothing and shelter. Bones were used for tools and weapons. The Plains Indian did not waste much of the buffalo after the hunt. As white men encountered the Plains Indian, they discovered a worthy opponent. Where tribes of the East lived in permanent villages and could be destroyed by attacking the fixed positions, Plains Indians were mobile. Settlements could be quickly taken down and moved. With horses, they were a difficult opponent in battle. And before the advent of the repeating rifle, Indians could fire many arrows, while his opponent would struggle to reload. Hunting grounds were important to the Plains Indians, and often they would fight other tribes for the best hunting grounds. President Andrew Johnson sent a peace commission to meet with the Northern Plains Indians that was more of a dictating of terms, allowing further westward expansion, including a threat that the U.S. Army would destroy them if they did not agree. There was an offer of compensation for giving up their lands, including homes and farmland, but what the commission failed to realize was the Indians were hunter-gatherers, not farmers. Further treaty negotiations would restrict Indian movement, and the western zone was now put under the command of Civil War hero William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman realized that as long as tribes continued their nomadic ways, that war with the Indian was inevitable. As more rail lines were established, there came settlements along those lines, and incursions on Indian territory would lead to clashes. General Philip Sheridan would soon join Sherman on the western frontier. Sheridan shared the same thoughts of Sherman as it pertained to the Indians. War was inevitable. Sheridan had fought Indians in the Northwest before the Civil War. He viewed Indians as barbarians. While Sheridan was fighting in the Northwest, he kept an Indian mistress. That did not prevent him from inflicting mild discipline on other Indians that included hangings for marginal offenses. But following the Civil War, the United States Army was in shambles. For soldiers who remained in service after the war, many were assigned to the western frontier. Postings were in desolate places and desertions were frequent. Alcohol flowed freely, which led to skirmishes with Indians. A treaty signed with the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Kiowa tribes prevented war, which gave Sheridan time. He knew the Army in its present form was ill-prepared for war. But the treaty was also an illustration of the biggest issues facing the Indians, functioning as a single unit. The treaty exploited this fact, and by reducing land allowed per tribe, increased the attacks within the tribes for the best hunting grounds. There was also an increase in the amount of alcohol being supplied to the tribes, which caused more problems. Alcohol was something that had always been used by settlers to barter with Indians. Quite often, buffalo hides were traded, and liquored young warriors often exercised their bravado, and skirmishes would erupt. Frightened settlers would call on the army for protection. Alcohol consumption would lead to attacks, often with horrifying results, including death, rape, and kidnappings. With every report of violence, it gave Sheridan all the motive he needed to mount a retaliation. General Sherman, angered by the raids, gave Sheridan approval to begin an offensive against the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. Sheridan quickly learned that the tribes were largely inactive during winter months. This was due to the scarcity of food not just for the Indians, but also for their horses. When winter settled in, their horses were malnourished and weak since grass didn't grow from temperatures that often dipped well below zero. Sheridan would use George Armstrong Custer to attack the winter villages of the Cheyenne and Arapaho near the Texas Panhandle. In late November 1868, Custer would arrive with more than 800 officers and men of the 7th Cavalry. They prepared an early morning assault on the Cheyenne village on the banks of the Washita River. In 10 minutes, the village was overrun. The village chief, Black Kettle, and his wife amongst the first to be killed. Women and children were executed unmercifully, and the Osage Indian guides that found the village committed some of the worst atrocities. The village was then burned to the ground. This was the beginning of a winter of misery for many of the Southern Plains tribes. The areas of western Kansas and southern Nebraska had been cleared of hostile Indians, and Army units benefited from Pawnee and Osage Indians who helped track and at times lead the attack against their bitter rivals, the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Other tribes like the Comanche and Kiowa had worked out an arrangement and peacefully moved out of the region. Much of the winter action had been in retaliation for raids conducted by factions within the tribes. The majority of Indian villages destroyed belonged to groups that had not participated. With trade routes, railroad lines, and the frontier secure, more white people moved in. But the election of Ulysses S. Grant as president in 1868 came with the potential for peace between white America and the Indians of the West. One of the first things Grant would do was to appoint an Indian to the post of Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Eli Parker was a member of the Iroquois who served under Grant in the Civil War. There were still some conflicts, but for Indians who resided on reservations, it was a period of relative calm. But soon alcohol would cause a breakdown in peace. But this time it was an alcohol-induced raid by an Army major. Major Eugene Baker, with the blessing of Sheridan, attacked a pagan Blackfoot village that became known as the Marias River Massacre. The village, which was not the intended target, had been inflicted by smallpox. The Indian scout that was along for the ride realized the village was peaceful and was threatened with death if he tried to warn the village. The chief, Heavy Runner, was alerted by a commotion and went running toward the advancing troops, waving a safe conduct pass from the Indian Bureau. He was shot dead, and the advancing soldiers continued to shoot at his dead body as they passed. Troops were instructed to shoot until all resistance was gone, but there was no resistance, and a drunken Major Baker then ordered the village burnt to the ground. Of the 170 or so deaths, 140 were women and children. There were survivors, and when several attempted to escape, they were hacked to death by the soldiers. When Baker realized survivors had smallpox, he abandoned them, leaving them to fend for themselves in the dead of winter. Following the Marias River Massacre, several survivors met with Indian Bureau agents. The survivors' report made its way to Congress, where there was a call for court-martials and dismissals for all involved. This came as a blow to Sheridan, who had been successfully clearing territory west of the Mississippi for white people. Eli Parker soon began to realize that treaties served no purpose if sides were unwilling to abide by the terms of the agreement. It gave Indians a false sense of independence, and since they were not a sovereign nation, they lacked any sense of authority. Parker felt the Indians would be better served if they became wards of the federal government. Sheridan would have survived the uproar from the massacre and continued the winter campaign. Between buffalo hunters decimating herds and villages being burned to the ground, the southern tribes were quickly being destroyed. The Red River War of 1874 and 75 was an assault on the Kiowa tribe villages. The Kiowa had previously worked out an arrangement with the army, but were now in the way. Soldiers assaulting villages were ordered not only to kill Indians, but also target their horses. If there were survivors, being without a horse meant they could neither wage war nor hunt. The Red River War was decisive because it deprived the Indians of the means to make war. It was the final phase of the war against the tribes of the Southern Plains, and for the survivors it meant life on the reservation was now a reality. As wagon trails and rail lines crossed the plains, settlers and migrants began encountering buffalo. Soon trains would be stopped by huge herds grazing on or near the rail beds. It was not unusual for a train to be held up for 4 hours. It was also not long before people started to shoot the buffalo for the sport of it. Rotting carcasses were soon a common sight on the plains, and buffalo numbers that were once estimated to be between 30 and 60 million were now in decline. Railroads soon advertised hunting by rail, and buffalo bounty hunters were joining the systematic extermination of the buffalo. General Sheridan wanted to create a medal with a dead buffalo on one side and a discouraged Indian on the other with the slogan, "Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." In a space of 10 to 15 years, the buffalo were removed from the plains, and by the end of the 19th century, there was one remaining herd of about 300 left. The United States Congress outlawed the killing of wildlife in Yellowstone Park, which was where the last herd still roamed and which also saved the buffalo. By destroying the buffalo, it had a two-pronged effect. It destroyed the main source of food for the Plains Indians, and as numbers fell, it caused the tribes to fight more with each other for the remaining herds. As the hunting grounds got smaller, raids into competing tribal hunting grounds increased, which benefited the Army in its fight with the Indians. It also made the Indian more dependent on the government, and forts that were originally built to protect routes and white settlers now became distribution sites for aid. To the north, the winter campaign of 1875 had failed to produce results. Sheridan decided that a summer campaign would be needed. The Army was still searching for Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse with a force of about 1,000 officers and soldiers under the command of General George Crook. Also joining in the search was General George Armstrong Custer and General Alfred Terry with the aid of Crow Indian Scouts. Villages were being discovered, and it was thought that one of those discovered was that of Sitting Bull. With General Crook involved in a skirmish elsewhere, Custer and Terry formulated a plan to attack a large Cheyenne and Lakota camp near the Little Bighorn River. Here Custer committed two fatal errors when he refused a Gatling gun regiment, and the second was he failed to heed the advice of his Crow guides not to divide his command. The Crow could not convince Custer that he was about to encounter a force far superior to the one that he had, and splitting his command was ill-advised. The second group was under the command of Major Marcus Reno, and he encountered the Indians first and was quickly overwhelmed, losing half his command. The group under Custer soon encountered a force led by Crazy Horse, who encircled the Army group and wiped out the force of 250 in less than 3 hours. Reno, who was fighting for his life, was saved when General Terry arrived and caused the Indians to scatter. Following the Battle of Little Bighorn, the combined Indian force broke camp and separated. The Army regrouped and followed in pursuit, systematically harassing and assaulting the fleeing tribes. Following a series of defeats over the next year, the Northern Plains Indians ceased to be a fighting force, and the Northern Territory was now secure. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, and also in the Washington Territory, a new series of Indian and white man clashes would erupt. The increasing migration not only affected California, but it also had an impact on traffic through the plains. With the invasion of the white miners came destruction and pollution. Valleys were destroyed as white man's greed dictated, and Indians soon struck back. California state government passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians in 1850. This addressed the punishment and protection of Indians, but it also provided the means of their destruction. It helped to facilitate the removal of their culture and their land. It also legalized slavery and allowed for the buying and selling of Indian children. With the backing of the California State Legislature, the California Volunteer Militia was formed. This group was made up of hunters and ranchers who were intent on killing all Indians. Entire Indian villages were destroyed and survivors were parceled out. Young women and children were sold to unmarried farmers, the rest as indentured slaves. In less than 25 years, the Indian population was reduced by 80%. In 1850, a skirmish with the Pomo Indians that attacked the cattle ranch caused the U.S. Army to attack an Indian village near Clear Lake. The village had nothing to do with the ranch attack, but all occupants were killed and the village was burned to the ground. 10 years later, another village was attacked and destroyed with all 88 occupants hacked to death. The local militia waited until the men left the village to hunt before attacking the village of only women, children, and elderly. The surviving Indians were provided protection in 3 military reservations that were built. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs agents were local from California and corrupt. Food and supplies destined for the 3 camps were often sold on the black market, and the Indians were slowly starving to death. With the Indian population reduced even further, local governments realized the imminent danger of total annihilation and began to help the remaining Indians. The Miwok tribe survived and recovered to work in the lumber, fishing, and farming industries. The Yahi tribe, which offered no resistance to white settlers, was wiped out save for one man. In 1911, Ishi walked out of the woods near Oroville, California, but no one understood his language as he was the last member of his tribe to survive. He died in 1916. In the Washington Territory, the Nez Perce Reservation was getting infiltrated by white miners. When the tribe was ordered to move to another reservation, in violation of a treaty, they took a stand. Several settlers were killed by the Indians, which brought the attention of the United States Army. The tribe of 700, which included over 500 women, children, and elders, embarked on a journey hoping to make it across the border into Canada. The journey would last 3 months and cover 1,700 miles with constant harassment from the Army. The last encounter would happen in the Bear Paw Mountains of Montana, about 50 miles from the Canadian border. Faced with artillery and Gatling guns, the tribe finally surrendered. They would be relocated to Oklahoma, where many would die of disease. Chief Red Cloud of the Oglala Sioux had been instrumental in convincing many Sioux to adapt to a reservation life. Red Cloud had fought a guerrilla-like war in the late 1860s against the Bozeman Trail, which passed through the hunting grounds of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux. But in 1870, Red Cloud was invited to meet with President Ulysses S. Grant, where a peace treaty resulted. From that agreement, the Pine Ridge Agency Reservation was established in South Dakota. But one aspect of reservation life that Indians despised was farming. Traditional hunting grounds were now occupied by homesteaders, and government officials encouraged the Indian to give up the horse, or at least attach it to a plow to tend to the planting of crops. The Sioux still attempted to preserve some traditions, one in particular being the ghost dance, which would be the cause of one final massacre. The ghost dance was a ritual that was performed leading up to the arrival of the Messiah. It was believed that the arrival of the Messiah, Indians would be delivered from their sins and brought to a paradise free of the white man. It was also believed that any attempt to disrupt the ghost dance by white man with gunfire would render the bullets useless, falling before reaching their intended target. Special clothing in the form of ghost shirts were worn, and the true believer would die during the dance and get a glimpse of the world beyond the white man. It was a dance of immortality, and it was unsettling to the white man. The nerves of the white settlers were on edge following the ghost dance, and coupled with the escape of Chief Bigfoot, who was rumored to be heading towards Pine Ridge, made the situation even worse. Bigfoot and his band were remnants of Sitting Bull's group that had fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Sitting Bull would be murdered in captivity by a government-paid Indian agent just before the ghost dance, which had put the dance participants in a foul mood. With the arrival of Bigfoot, tensions remained high at Pine Ridge, and it was decided that Bigfoot's group needed to be moved to another reservation. Instructions were sent to the group to gather their belongings and that they would be prisoners but would be provided with food and safe transportation off the reservation. They were also instructed to bring and surrender their firearms, but the weapons they surrendered were older, and the Army decided to search the village and remove anything that could be used as a weapon. Colonel James Forsyth was in charge of the 7th Cavalry, and he was getting angry at Bigfoot, feeling that he was being deceived. During the search of the village, there were other weapons found, but there were no repeating rifles that were reported to be in the Indians' possession. When an older warrior raised the rifle over his head as he was approached by soldiers and ordered to surrender the weapon, a shot rang out. It is unclear if it was accidental, but what followed was mayhem. Several warriors started firing at soldiers, and when they ran out of ammunition, they would grab any rifle that was on the ground and continue firing. Bigfoot would die in the initial volley. He was in poor health and was laying on the ground under a blanket when he was killed. Soon the fighting spread to the village, with remaining warriors being shot by soldiers as they fled. But it was the village where the most heinous aspect of the Wounded Knee Massacre would occur. Women, children, and elders would now incur the wrath of the soldiers. Women running with infants were gunned down, and on the ridge above the village, the Army had deployed several Hotchkiss guns. The guns fired a canister with encased metal balls for maximum effect. Once the soldiers had cleared out of the village, the Hotchkiss guns fired indiscriminately on the village for about 30 minutes. There were still warriors in the village, but it was mostly unarmed combatants. Once resistance ceased, the guns were turned to a gulch where some of the Indians had escaped to. Again, the guns opened up with devastating results. A ceasefire was called, as well as a plea for survivors to surrender. Army losses amounted to 1 officer and 24 enlisted men killed, with another 40 or so wounded. 20 soldiers would be awarded the highest military award, the Congressional Medal of Honor for valor in battle. Official Indian casualties were listed at 146 dead, of which 64 were women and children. 50 were counted as wounded. But unofficial totals listed the dead at over 350. Wounded Knee would mark the end of most organized resistance to the white man's rule. Red Cloud met with several tribes to discuss surrender to prevent more massacres. Members of the Oglala and Brule tribes had misgivings about surrendering their rifles, but eventually did, and moved to the Pine Ridge Reservation. All that was left was the Lakota, who were apprehensive as well about surrendering their weapons. General Nelson Miles wisely decided when meeting with the tribe not to conduct a search as they had at Wounded Knee. Kicking Bear, chief of the 5,000-member tribe, refused to hand his rifle over to just a plain clerk. He sought out General Miles, where he laid his rifle at the general's feet. Soon his warriors relinquished their rifles as well. The war in the West was finally over, and Kicking Bear would later become part of Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. With the end of organized Indian activity after Wounded Knee, reservations would become the final home of all tribes. What had started as a large western Indian territory was now abandoned due to the demands of miners, settlers, ranchers, and traders. Over 370 treaties had been negotiated where the Indians relinquished millions of acres of their homeland. The reservations were being run by white agents of the Indian Bureau, and its occupants were now fully dependent on aid. There were still a few roaming bands that refused to surrender, but they were eventually caught or killed. Early reservation life was rife with disease and malnutrition. Alcohol abuse was now an epidemic, and with different tribes occupying the same reservation, there were always conflicts which would continue to cause a disintegration of Indian society. In 1877, a new phase of assimilation began when Captain Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. By 1891, through an act of Congress, Indian children were forcibly taken from their homes and placed in schools. There were more than 175 schools, and here children were stripped of their hair, native clothing, and required to wear a military uniform. There were no vacations, and during extended time off, children were placed in homes of white people as servants. They were prohibited from speaking their native language and received moral Christian training. Punishment for violating school policy was starvation and physical abuse. This was the Kill the Indian, Save the Man policy adopted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and its goal was to break down Indian resistance. Children began to see themselves as members of a race of Indian rather than as a tribal member. Thousands of children would never return home, either due to death or moved elsewhere, having lost contact with their families. The schools continued to operate until the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. As part of the New Deal, the industrial schools were shut down, although 49 still continued to operate. Sadly, the last of these schools did not close until 1990, when the Phoenix Indian School finally closed its doors. Indian children are still vulnerable, and surveys done in the 1960s and 70s found that 25 to 35% of children are still being separated from their families and placed in foster care. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed the Indian Child Welfare Act that established standards for child removal. The act had limited success, mostly due to a lack of funding. It also found that less than 10% of removed children were placed in an Indian-supervised foster care as stipulated by the act. As late as 2011, the South Dakota Department of Social Services was removing an average of 700 children annually. The Indian population of South Dakota made up less than 15% of the population, which means the percentage removed is well above children of other ethnicity. There are still laws pertaining to Indian industrial schools in effect. 25 U.S.C. 302 states that children may still be placed in reform school without parental consent, and 25 U.S.C. 283 still upholds the school's right to withhold food for failure to attend class. Many former students of the schools exhibited symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder over the years. Lawsuits have been filed, in particular against the Catholic Church, which ran many of the schools, by survivors who suffered physical, mental, and sexual abuse. In 1887, the General Allotment Act, or Dawes Act, became law. The goal of the act was to break up tribal ownership of land and open reservations for non-Indian settlement. Congress divided reservations into 160 and 80-acre plots and granted ownership to family heads and individual tribal members. The 138 million acres of reservation land allotted in 1887 would soon be reduced to 48 million acres by 1934. It was an expansion of the Discovery Doctrine and was made even more humiliating for Indians when significant amount of individual plots were lost due to state tax foreclosures. Without any work on the reservations and taxes required to be paid for land ownership, many Indians lost their homes. The reservations were administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and agents of the Bureau were responsible for providing assistance. But corruption was rampant, and even after the 1883 Civil Servant Act to address corruption in the federal government, it did not have much of an impact on the Bureau for many years. In the early 1900s, the Bureau began to interfere in the daily lives and personal habits of the Indians. Bureau members became educators, protectors, and providers. Customs were being modified or discontinued, such as long hair, face painting, and traditional Indian clothing, which were forbidden, as well as dances. Failure to adhere to the rules was punishable by withholding of food and other needed supplies. These items were part of agreements or treaties signed when Indians gave up land. There was also other punishments, including imprisonment by hard labor. In 1920, Congress passed the Mineral Leasing Act, which allowed speculators to acquire large tracts of public lands. Oil was discovered on the Osage Reservation in 1900, but it wasn't until 1920 that the tribe received royalties. This was a successful development for Indians, although individual cases of corruption took place. One included a judge who appointed a banker to oversee a 7-year-old's inheritance of an oil-producing property. Even though royalties were substantial, the banker practically starved the girl due to the small stipend she received. Eventually, the girl was found to be poisoned, but she survived. Also in the 1920s, the Brookings Institute released the Merriam Report, which was the first in-depth analysis of reservation life. It found poverty and a startling lack of health care and education. Reforms were recommended, including the hiring of Indians to posts in the Indian Bureau, and in 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt appointed John Collier to be the Commissioner of the Indian Bureau. Collier instituted many of the recommendations of the report. The results were mixed, but it did resolve some long-standing issues, including the repeal of a 50-year-old law allowing the sale of reservation land to white people. Forward progress was stopped in 1953 with the adoption of the Termination Act. The act ended the relationship between tribes and the federal government, and soon 109 tribes lost their status. The end result expected was that members of terminated tribes would move to urban areas and live like non-Indians. It also shifted the burden of support from federal to state and local governments. Land owned by the terminated tribes was sold to the government and retained as public land, which was soon opened to speculators. Indian resistance and public protest against the Termination Act began to mount by the end of the 1950s. It became clear that the act led to further economic hardship for Indians and was the cause of more land loss. Congressional members actively discussed the repeal of the act, and in 1970, President Richard Nixon spoke publicly of the moral and legal implications of the act. It was finally appealed in 1988, and many of the terminated tribes have since had their recognition restored. In 1961, over 500 members of 90 tribes attended the nationwide Indian Conference in Chicago. Several organizations formed following the conference included the National Indian Youth Council and the American Indian Movement. Indians began uniting to take control of their future and to bring attention to public and federal officials of the challenges facing Indians. In 1969, a group of Indians from several tribes took control of the former federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. Using the Discovery Doctrine, they held the island for 19 months. In 1973, there was a 10-week siege on the Pine Ridge Reservation at the site of the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre that drew national and worldwide attention. As part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiative, there were improvements on reservations. 6 tribal colleges were created, and by 2015 the number had grown to 37. President Nixon appointed Louis Bruce, a Sioux Mohawk, to lead the Indian Bureau. Bruce was the 3rd Indian to be named, and he led a reorganization of the Bureau, with Indians being named to many of the top positions. There was more progress during the late 1970s as congressional action was approved to enhance educational opportunities and improve the access to medical care. In 1978, Congress enacted the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which restored many of the ceremonies that had been banned for close to a century. Specifically, ceremonial dances were allowed, as well as the use of sweat lodges and eagle feathers for religious ceremonies. But progress gained in the 1960s and 1970s was stunted in the 1980s. Reservations were still relying on government aid, and budget cutting hit healthcare and education hard. This would lead to the introduction of gaming and casino parlors on reservations. States were leery of the newfound revenue stream, and suits were filed to challenge the legality. But the United States Supreme Court struck down the suits, and in 1988, regulatory responsibility was given to the federal government with the passage of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. This gave the Interior Secretary final approval on how revenue from the gaming was dispersed, with priority going to tribal government operations before any money goes to individual tribe members. By 2013, there were gaming facilities in 28 states operating on reservations. In the 1990s, there was more protections put in place to ensure the survival of Indian arts and languages. President Bill Clinton created the Office of Tribal Justice to promote government-to-government relations and ensure tribal security in the courts. His administration also went to great lengths to appoint Indians to several high-level positions. This trend continued in the Obama administration, including the approval of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights Act of 2007. The United States, along with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were late in supporting the declaration, but eventually all did. In 2010, the United States Congress issued a resolution apologizing to Native Americans for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect. It was a non-binding resolution, and there was no ceremony or press release announcing the resolution. In December 2010, at a White House conference with tribal leaders, President Obama declared that by signing the resolution, the United States had finally recognized the sad and painful chapters in American history. Today, life on the reservation is still challenging as progress has been uneven. The introduction of gaming has provided a boom for some, and tribes like the Osage still receive royalties from oil revenue. Poverty runs at 30% nationwide, and in South Dakota it is closer to 50%. A recent visit to the Cheyenne River, Standing Rock, and Pine Ridge reservations, I encountered a group of Sioux women. They were selling handmade items, and after purchasing several, they thanked me. As I was leaving, I was told that it was the only way they can put food on the table. High unemployment, water supply issues, and inadequate schools continue to plague. Reservations are still dealing with white intrusion. Recently, the Keystone Pipeline through Standing Rock Reservation led to an armed standoff between tribes and state and local authorities. Concern for environmental safety and destruction of sacred land were the key issues, and recently a similar pipeline operated by Keystone leaked over 210,000 gallons of oil. Tribes have also allowed corporation access to tribal land in an attempt to raise revenue and create jobs, but this often leads to exploitation. In the 1970s, uranium was being mined by energy companies in the Black Hills of South Dakota. So much was removed from that area that it became irradiated. In the Four Corners region, leasing agreements were signed for the removal of coal, which polluted groundwater, and in some cases the amount of water removed from the ground for coal operation severely reduced the water table. Life off the reservation has also presented challenges, but there are many successful transitions. Indians have long served in the military, including the Stockbridge Indians, who served as Minutemen in the Revolutionary War. In both World Wars, Indians served as code talkers and provided a vital, unbreakable code to communicate. Korea and Vietnam also had Indians providing service to their country, and today between 20,000 and 30,000 proudly serve. There are large population centers in some of the major cities in the United States. Although separated from their tribes, many urbanized Indians try to retain a sense of culture by hosting language classes, powwows, and cultural shows. Indian centers also provide job counseling, drug and alcohol prevention, and rehabilitation services. Indian populations have increased more than 25% between 2000 and 2010, which was double the growth for the rest of the country. Health continues to be a concern as Indians are still susceptible to disease such as tuberculosis, and alcoholism is always a concern. Most recently, HIV and AIDS-related deaths have been on the rise. Indians are the poorest group in the United States, with an economic gap between Indian and white households being 40% less. But the last 50 years have witnessed a resurgence in Indian affairs and tribal identity, as well as cultural awareness, becoming important aspects of Indian life again. Indians survived, tribes survived assimilation and will continue on. Native society could be transformed, but it could not and did not become extinct.